I am really interested in understanding wines of origin, understanding what makes a wine uniquely itself. And when I look at the systematic approach, it helps us to understand the kind of structural components of wine, but it doesn't speak at all to the origin of wine or the meaning of the wines. And so if students think that that's the end way of tasting, then you're missing all the joy, all the enthusiasm, all the identity of a wine.
Sit back and grab a glass. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today, beautiful Southern California. About to have a conversation with Tanya Morning Star, the CEO of the Cellar Muse. Hey, listen, I'm going to launch a new podcast called The Song of America. Song of America is the name of a book written by the famed restaurateur, Monsieur George Mardikian in San Francisco. And the book is about his trek to America and his success as a restaurateur. I took the name. I was able to get permission from the Sun, and I created a podcast around stories of immigration that turned into social, financial, or political success. And so the first episode is the Agajanian brothers, crazy stories about early days of racing in America, as well as immigration to the United States by the grandfather. So have a listen to that. Hey, give me a good review. If you don't like it, then don't review it at all. Right? And subscribe, please. But not while we're here. We tried this once before with Tanya Morning Star, and complete failure on the technical side. So we're back in studio together. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You know, I asked you, what do you call yourself? And I said CEO, and you go, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So, but you just got done telling me about your certification and your teaching of champagne to professionals. And I want to just dovetail off of that because this is an interesting part of our industry right now. Here you are certified to teach certain aspects or maybe the entire history of champagne to professionals. What does that mean? What does that mean to professionals? What do you call a professional?
Well, I guess see how I'm going to answer that question. So essentially, the wine boards of the world have marketing money that they want to invest in training people who work with their wines. And so in the case we were discussing the champagne specialist certification and some of the other, I was talking about a special sensory workshop that I developed to decode the winemaking process of champagne, and also, as I said it, to listen for the different players in the symphony. These are things that wine boards support. So, for example, they want us to interact with sommelier, journalists, importers, salespeople, and help them to understand their wines better so that they can represent them better. So in those cases, sometimes wine boards like the Comité Champagne will sponsor and support curriculums that, for example, that I produce, like the sensory workshop. And then I can invite people in those categories or wine students who are pursuing higher level certifications in hopes to enter into the industry and offer it for, virtually free. Now, the Champagne Specialist course is a paid course, but the Comité Champagne developed it and, brought me and a couple of other educators out there to train to teach it. Well,
let me ask this. This is this balancing act that we're in. Because, and I think generationally, it happens all the time. And the language of wine was different for Michael Broadbent and Harry Waugh than it was in my father, than it was for you and I, and maybe different for the future generations. Yeah. But there's this whole movement socially about, I don't ever believe in demystifying wine. I don't believe in the idea of simplifying wine because it's not simple. And it's just, if you want to know more, learn more, right?
Exactly.
But so the idea of training professionals on the sensory perception of champagne and I love this concept of picking the instruments out of the symphony. It's a really great analogy. Does that fly in the face of what this generation that's coming in now thinks wine should be accessible to everybody and all, whatever those things mean, innovation, whatever that means in the wine trade? Is it?
Yeah, I don't think those things are incongruent at all. In fact, it's really, really important to me to teach what you were saying, about making things specific and accessible and not oversimplifying. To me, I like kind of to equate it to falling in love, specializing. Your previous knowledge may or may not be useful.
Yeah, right.
And what you really need to show up with is your curiosity and your your openness to discovering about that subject, right? And through doing that, I always say you can specialize before you generalize if you are willing to be deeply curious and engage your love. So I do feel that teaching complex subjects is not exclusionary. And the way that I do it, I think I have, kind of a special approach to that, seems to be working and makes people feel really welcome. And so even when I'm teaching courses that are designed for high level specialty or designed really to teach people who are already in the wine trade, of course, there are a lot of enthusiasts that end up in those spaces. And I think that and I have a way of welcoming them. Also, I really, really feel that it's important to me that everybody feels ready to show up as they are. And that means even when we're talking about complex subjects like champagne, the more that we can not oversimplify, but demystify and come together, the more people can bring their authentic selves into that moment. And when that's invited, I think that everybody really benefits and people don't feel like they can approach really complex subjects. So to me, I don't really teach beginners, but as long as you've got kind of a basic understanding of vini vidi, as we call it, winemaking and a knowledge on a base level that allows you to enter into a certain subject, we can fly pretty high together.
But the consumer side of this, I mean, isn't this the allure of what wine is? And I'm trying to get to this, my position on this, which is, yes, wine is consumer oriented. We need consumers, but the allure of wine, the study of wine, the character of wine, the reason we, crave a particular type of wine at dinner time is in itself the complexity and the story, and that automatically leads you, if you're interested, to learn more about soil if you want, or trellising, or the things that go into changing the expression of a wine. So I'm just having a hard time with what the general public perception of what wine is and where it needs to go versus the actuality of it, which hasn't changed for 12,000 years. It's still the same product, right? I mean,
somewhat.
Effectively.
Yeah.
Hopefully it takes a little better than those days. But it's so on the consumer side, how are you received with this kind of teaching when you do this?
Well, I think great. I mean, one of the things is, I've been in the industry for a lot of years, and last time we did this, we introduced me a little bit more, but and mentioned that I'm also a historian and taught wine history at college level for a decade, and also have an online wine history course that I created that people can come to and find out about, just to mention that. But as far as consumers in the classroom, all that to say that over the last 30 years, I have seen such a wonderful transformation in our industry, from gatekeeping of knowledge on the part of, snooty somms, to a world where consumers are savvy and self-directed, and professionals are expected to be trusted advisors and guides, as opposed to some kind of gods that have some information or some way of accessing the pleasure of wine that nobody else can touch. And I love that. It expects more of professionals because consumers are more deeply interested. And that also coincides with the rise of enotourism and this desire for people to have more intimate experiences with wine, which I love. So I hope that kind of answers your question, that I think that the enthusiast has a really different place in the world than they had before. I think that serious enthusiasts 30 years ago that were learning about wine were usually wealthy people who had deep cellars and were more part of this elite access to wine. And I love that that's really, really changing. It's an important part of my work.
That's an interesting thought. It is, I suppose, my dad got into it. He was business. Then he fell in love with it once. He was a pharmacist by trade, counting pills, and all of a sudden, there's a liquor store became part of his chain, the small chain he had. And wow, this was really fun. People aren't sick when they come in and complain. They come in and they go, "Hey, I'm looking for something really fun to do."
Yeah.
And so he started spending more time over there, and he fell in love with the product and was quite knowledgeable and traveled the world and went to classes. But I suppose you're right. I suppose we're casting a larger net to have people be interested in the product. And I have this romantic view that all generations come around at some point to have a curiosity about what it is. But it still doesn't answer the question, is it simplifiable? And I don't believe that it is. But how important is the story? You talk about history, and I had a conversation. Chad Ludington, you know who he is? I think he's a master of wine. Maybe he's not. But anyway, I had a conversation with him yesterday, and he was correcting himself, one of these historians, where he says, in 1375, no, I'm sorry, 1350, and I'm like, wow, I'm not sure that I'm that granular with my wine history. And I wonder if that sort of intimidates people into the subject versus just trying to learn why, they relate to one glass rather than another.
I think that this is an interesting subject to kind of weave into what we were talking about before, the state of our industry, how our enthusiasm as professionals or consumers or wherever we're at in that continuum, why the story matters now, maybe more than ever. And I was thinking as you were talking about how the rise of this savvy, curious, loving, if you will, consumer, right? If we're talking about curiosity being about love, coincides with, of course, our deepening access to information, right? The great equalizer, the internet, and technology. But also one of the things that access has brought us as humans is a fracturization of our mentality, right? We're a million places at once. We're expected to be tracking all kinds of information and events that are happening in faraway places. And I just don't think that our nervous systems as a species are developing fast enough to take all of this. So we're anxious, we're all exhibiting tension issues, and this...
Good thought.
And so the wine curiosity, wine as a hobby can heal this mentality because it's a whole body experience. When we are engaging in the study of wine and the exploration of wine, we're using everything about ourselves. We're using our physicality, all of our senses, our front and back of our brain, right? The primitive memory part that's associating with our sense of smell and taste, our analytical aspect, our social personalities. It's really healthy behavior. And it drops people into one place and time. And I think this is why more young people are interested in this specificity. I think they're drinking less, they're engaging differently. And I think that the story connects to this ability for us to be present with other people. And in a global world, that means other people in a vineyard on the other side of the world, maybe, that we'll never meet, but we're still in one place, in one time, one terroir that made that wine, one culture, one person, or a team of people. And here we are choosing it in our classroom or at our table to share with real people that are in front of us. And that to me is really great. And this kind of enthusiasm has a reciprocal effect, because we are in conversation with the people and traditions who make wine, right? Whether we ever talk to them, simply by putting that wine into our bodies. That the smaller producers, the smaller appellations have never been... It's such an exciting time to love wine, because when people are interested in those stories and purchase those lesser known wines or appellations, the people who make them have financial incentive to elaborate better the truth of how to make the best wine in that place. And so I think there's a lot more out there to discover. For example, one of my expertises is in Bourgogne wines, a subject that cannot be simplified, that is endless, right? And I really believe that you do not have to be a wealthy collector to love Bourgogne wines and to engage in the value system of terroir that Bourgogne wines has to offer, which is one place, one time, one, the name of the vineyard, the climat is the name of the wine, right?
Mm-hmm.
That place. And so I think, ranging from, if you're in the Macon, for example, you can have that experience of understanding that specificity for $25,
It's true.
And some of those wines are now getting good enough so that you can put them away for a little while. And so that people who are not wildly wealthy can start to cellar things for a few years and see how they become more interesting.
Let me stop you there for a second. That's a really good point, particularly since the evolution of Bourgogne wines, particularly entry level. And I think most of the consumers that go to the supermarket, the entry level Bourgogne wines that are there are just not very good representations of what they could be at a price that's very palatable.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're talking about Grand Cru vineyards. You can get a nice Bourgogne Rouge if you go to the right maker. But let me back that up a little bit. Yeah, I think. Was it Paul Meyer who tried to buy a property there and got this 12th century rule thrown at him and it fell out of escrow? But his comment was basically all enophiles, all wine and collectors end up in Burgundy because of this complexity and this idea of terroir is so specific and important.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go back to the consumer for a second. You said something really interesting, the enthusiasm, particularly from an educator like you, who gets in front of a group and lights up, and whether it's a consumer group or a professional group, you can elude this. And I had to say something. I think I mentioned before we started that I'm back on the Little League field as the old guy, the grandpa, and I'm working with 7-year-olds. and it hit me that the reason I'm successful there, and I say that tongue in cheek, is because I am enthusiastic about it. Yeah. I do love it. And is why I would go out on my Saturday afternoon as a 66-year-old on Tuesday night and Saturday afternoon and play baseball with a bunch of 7-year-olds that have a hard time even understanding the game. And what they respond to is the enthusiasm I have because it's such a great game and I have so much fun playing it and teaching it. And I think that's really important on your side to stimulate, the intellectual thought process of learning about wine, because it is exciting. It can be, or it can be completely droll and blah, 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 not the French word droll meaning funny, but the English version.
Yeah.
How do you do that? How are you instilling this enthusiasm? Is just passion natural?
Well, I love the word enthusiasm. It's a beautiful word. And I think that, first of all, being accessible myself is important. I want to say, for example, I do a lot of mentorship. I love to mentor people in their wine path, professional and personal, to enjoying more and finding what their way towards their goals with wine. And I had a student who went through the WSET diploma with me, and they were starting to teach and they were feeling nervous about showing up in a classroom and having really smart people ask really hard questions that they might not know the answer to. And I said, listen, you know very well that none of us know the answers to every question. And so every teacher at the beginning goes through this anxiety that they're not going to be able to perform perfectly. Like you were saying, get the exact right dates. And I said, when you don't know something in front of a classroom, it's this wonderful opportunity to make everybody else realize that you're human, that they're smart, because in the room, maybe somebody knows the answer, or maybe collectively you can discover it. And so actually showing ourselves as real as teachers and engaging in the value of our students, I think really brings people out of a lot of the anxiety that historically is centered around wine around wine generally, that the person next to us knows more than us and is a better taster and all of this kind of BS, instead of kind of being open, curious, and sharing our flaws and our joyous, discoveries. So I think that's really a part of it, is seeing myself as imperfect as an opportunity. And always, wine in a wine classroom is full of really smart people. There are people, my students have PhDs, they have, diverse educations in a multitude of subjects. They bring so much to the exploration of the subject that we're on hand. Even if I am the expert, I learned so much from them. So I think that attitude is really, really key to making people feel welcome and bringing people into their best exploration of a subject together.
I think you're right. I think that does break down the barriers, that you have a personal concern with their path to understand this, and that tends to loosen up the environment a little bit. And I think this, I hate to say it, I mean, it works with 7-year-olds. And why wouldn't it work with adults? You have a true compassion for their outlook and their concern of what they're doing. How important do you think that is? You said something interesting. You said about, the tasting, and, there's some people that can sit in front of a row of wines, all Cabernets from the same vintage, and talk about the appellation possibly. I possibly could do that. I mean, I tasted a lot of wines, 100,000 wines in my career, but I have certain, my outlook, leading to this question, my outlook when I tasted those wines wasn't to do that.
Yeah.
I didn't blind taste. I sat there every Tuesday from 9 to 2 and tasted wines. But my job was to find the best value. So my skill set in this industry is tasting a wine and being able to position it from a price standpoint where it belongs, not necessarily where it's being sold at, but where it would belong based on a price, value, quality. Yes, I can dissect the wine. I can tell you about the structure. I can do all those things. But not everybody can do that.
Yeah.
But many people can blind taste much better than I can. And I'm wondering where you think your skill set is in this industry, obviously education. And then how important do you think it really is to be able to say, well, I sense raspberries and blackberries and cocoa and, all those things, and confuse people like.
I love this question, and I think about it a lot, in fact, because I have my own way of teaching tasting. I've taught all WSET levels and also, practiced both systematic and deductive approaches and everything else. So I have had to teach lots of different tasting rationales in my experience as an educator. But I found myself a few years back realizing that I had allowed the propaganda to enter my head that from the movie Somm, for example, that these mostly guys are these gods with special skills that none of us have, including me, and it's like, and that was, so I guess I want to I joined a group of a tasting group of a Somm deductive approach. And first of all, I realized that there was, how do I want to say this? I was so curious at this stage of my life how I still had something in my mind telling me that I couldn't do that. And it's really just, it's not a trick, in fact, and I'm going to explain that. I don't want to get too off track here. For me, I am really interested in understanding wines of origin, understanding what makes a wine uniquely itself. And so when I'm thinking about tasting rationales, that is what I am curious about, which is why I do teach tasting a little bit differently. And when I look at the systematic approach, the WSET approach, for example, it helps us to understand the kind of structural components of wine, but it doesn't speak at all to the origin of wine or the meaning of the wine. And so if students think that that's the end way of tasting, then you're missing all the joy, all the enthusiasm, all the identity of a wine. Many of the greatest wines in the world, for example, are medium, medium plus, medium, medium plus. If you go to Bourgogne, all the greatest wines of Bourgogne, they're going to be medium, medium plus all along the way. How interesting is that? Not. Does it point to anything meaningful? No, right? And so that is a stepping stone being able to understand the structural components of wine to being able to understand wine. They're not the same thing. And the deductive approach or the SOM approach ends up looking a little mysterious, but it essentially gets a little bit more towards identity, but in a very technical kind of way that if you learn how to execute it and you also understand wines of origin, you can actually blind taste and it's not that hard, in fact. And I loved exploring, demystifying that process as well. And then in the end, what I'm interested in is transparently tasting for origin. So that means really understanding what the impacts of the various aspects of terroir are on the sensory experience. So, for example, elevation, soil type, climate, proximity to bodies of water, wind, all of these things, and then how people respond to those environmental issues is essentially what terroir is. And so if we're really exploring one place, right? This is how I say specialized education is about, is about intimacy, right? You're looking at one place, one wine, right? And understanding all of these elements and then translating them to the actual sensory experience so that people can start to taste and be like, oh, the quality of the acidity is like this. And I understand, I know exactly where I am.
That's probably not an easy thing for people to grasp onto originally.
So I don't think that this is actually hard, and so there's a way that I like to approach this kind of teaching that is really about understanding the place itself. And I think once you can go through that exploration, it starts to make sense. If you have a holistic picture in your teaching, instead of didactically going through, some kind of linear or abstracted or separated, exploration of the elements of what make a wine itself. If you look at it as a whole picture, people can engage with it, imagine it, and then it makes sense why wine tastes the way it is, which is why I love to teach through immersion. So I do lead immersive educational experiences in France, Italy, and California. I've got one coming up in Sonoma. I'll be doing one in Champagne in May, Bourgogne in September, around Lake Garda also in October. And when I do that, it's not just taking people touring. I curate highly. The wineries we go to are not necessarily the most prestigious, but sometimes they're places that aren't open to the public that'll receive me, and have that access. Definitely want to provide people with access, but curate the most complete learning experience of that place. So
why do they come to you over all the millions of let's jump on that concept of Euro what'd you call it?
Eno travel or
Eno travel, because and I'm going to say it with this premise. I do believe, and I think has always been this way. It's just now becoming more obvious and more important that experiential changes, or experiential episodes are what drive wine and what keep people loyal to a brand. They're going to reflect every time they see this, and things are happening in France in particular where wine tourism is becoming actually a thing. It never was. You couldn't go to a tasting room in Bordeaux until recently, really.
Yeah.
And so why do they choose Tanya Morning Star's program over, what was the name of the famous travel company in the 70s, English group? Anyway, why? Why do they do that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons. First of all, I only lead tours in places where I have really special access. So where I have deep relationships with the people who are culture makers and or preserving cultural heritage through their work. And I'm able to get those people to meet with us. For example, in Bourgogne, we visit, some places that don't receive guests. And in Champagne, that's also going to be the case, that some places that don't receive guests will receive my students enthusiastically and give us a lot of time with the cellar master or the family. And in Borgogne, for example, the map maker Sylvain Pizio had lunch with us,
Oh, wow.
and the president of the partnership with UNESCO for the preservation of the climat, invited us to his winery in Maurice Saint-Denis, and we tasted all the climat. I like to do things. We went to La Flève and met with Olivier, and tasted all the wines, and then I filled my backpack with single climat wines, and everyone took their glasses, and we walked from Plouny-Morichet through Meursault, stopping in the climat and tasting the wine. And then you really understand, you've met the winemaker, you've seen the winery, but then we're walking through the vineyards, touching the soil, looking at the slope, tasting this one,
so
understanding it, then moving on to the next. We know why they're different. And
Let me
so
stop you there. I mean, this is a very extraordinary trip. I mean, you're probably half of the words not understood by most people. So how do we get this to the consumer who's at home, only sees at the supermarket the entry-level Bourgognes or Veuve Clicquot for that matter? I had to tell you a funny story. You obviously speak French to a certain extent. So there's I'm not going to say who it is, but somebody named their spa in Napa Rendezvous. And I'm like, why would you do that? It says Veuve means widow.
Yeah. That's funny.
Anyway, so
I do speak French and Italian. And I think that's one of the things is that I don't take people places where I don't have intimate relationships with that I can share. Because all the people who travel with me, they are savvy travelers. They're super smart. They can organize their own trips, and they do. But this is different, right? And so then your next question, how do we get that to the consumer?
How do we make people feel that energy that you have, but they can't jump on a plane and go to Bourgogne or Champagne?
Yeah, not everybody. I do have some projects. They're a little top secret, but I have a project to address this, home experience for enthusiasts that can't get on a plane, but you'll have to wait for that and follow me. But I do think that teaching in the classroom, the way that I like to teach, almost gives people a relief as if they've taken a little adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And in the way that I teach holistically. But I think that this experience, a lot of people they don't want necessarily to know all of these things. And so when you have professionals who have had these experiences, they're the ones who share that next step. There are enthusiasts who do want to take these trips, who want to deeply understand the landscape and the culture, and how those things are, and history, and how they're tied in together. But not everybody can afford that or is ready for that. They may want to have that glass of wine and they want to understand something about it that brings them into the present moment, but they don't need everything. And so that's why training professionals or sometimes guiding journalists or writers, which is another thing that I do, is so important, because then we bring home that whole experience, that deep understanding, that intimacy, and we can share it easily with a person, even if we have an exchange of just a couple sentences. When that wine gets put into their hand, those are the appropriate sentences that spark that person's imagination so that they enjoy more. So there's a lot of levels of what we want to know, what we need to know to enjoy wine most fully. And I think there's a couple different kinds of wine. There's engineered wines that are delicious but don't tell a story of place, and then that's fine. Not very interested in those myself. But
formula wines, we call them.
But they could be delicious, and then there's wines of origin, and with wines of origin, something about that connection is important, but it doesn't have. Nobody wants the somm who's like telling you the whole story and you're like, okay, I really didn't need to, I don't need to know all those things. But sometimes just giving a little bit of truth and bringing people into the specific moment is all that's required.
Yesterday, I had a call with a doctor's group. You're probably aware of some of these, the concierge medicine is becoming very popular, and this is sort of a holistic thing. And I really wanted to hear about it because I take that very seriously.
Yeah.
And when he saw the studio here in the
Mm-hmm.
background, first he says, I used to be a sound engineer, so he was really interested in what I was doing. And second, he says, you're in wine. He goes, I have this, and I found this very refreshing, and I don't hear it very often. And I have to tell my friends when we go to dinner, because we like to bring our own bottles, as you probably do. But I tell them, if we're going to go to an Italian restaurant, do not bring, duck horn or silver oak or whatever, basic Napa stuff. I said, we need to bring the wines of the origin of the food, and let's start sort of understanding that. And so this guy voluntarily said, look, I go to a restaurant, and if I'm in an Italian place, I ask for the list, and I want the Psalms recommendation for the food that we're eating from Italy.
Yeah.
And then he quoted what, grows together, goes together. And I think that was such a refreshing start of a conversation for somebody that actually is seeking. And the point I was going to make was, I thought by the time we had done chatting about his last experience at the Italian restaurant, that he had been to Barolo. He was talking about it as if, he was walking the vineyards of the famed hill, and I'm like, well, I was just there and blah, blah, blah. He goes, no, I've never been. And so his experience and his knowledge of Barolo had strictly come from eating at Italian restaurants, talking to the Somm, and drinking the wines of the region. And I go, wow, that's really powerful way to do it and not have to leave. You could do it at home too as well. But if you're disciplined enough to think that way.
It's such a relief. It's why sometimes I remember one day I was studying, and my kids came into when my son came into the room, and he was like, why are you so happy? And I was like, I've just spent 2 hours in Provence in my mind, and that makes me really happy.
That's great.
And, so I think that, yes, we're talking about engaging our imagination, through multi-sensory modalities. And that can be through tasting, reading, looking at maps, watching, films, or drone footage, which is incredible. Some regions have great drone footage. But I think that you said something that I wanted to pick up on, which was about your friend and what goes together, grows together. And although I think there's two ways to kind of approach that. One way is to say another thing that I love, for example, thinking about champagne and how champagne is consumed all over the world, how it's important to all of us, right? For our best moments, we want to have champagne, even when there's other delicious wines that we could have. That opening up to all of the cuisines that champagne can serve, and all of the cultural sensory perspectives that the tasters and drinkers have. Cultural sensory, right? And this brings us back to the idea of language and how we talk about wine. Because if we're going from a systematic or deductive or this formulaic tasting approach, usually designed by British people, then it excludes everybody else in the world with all their different smell, taste, and cultural experiences, right? So I love this idea of opening up wine to be an international ambassador of love and peace, essentially, in a way, because we're sharing something with people from another part of the world. And then the other thing is to, if you're thinking what goes together, grows together. So thinking outside the box and welcoming other cultures into your sensory experience, right? Into that in a partnership is one thing. And then what goes together, grows together falls into something that is really kind of my ballywick, which is what I was thinking about, do you want to be called CEO? And essentially I want to be called a preserver of cultural heritage because I feel that what I do, I deeply invest in understanding why and how something is the way that it is. I research and become allies with the people who are progressing traditions, creating traditions, preserving traditions. I've worked with UNESCO, as I mentioned. And so when we think about what goes together, grows together, it is true that we could pair wines in a lot of different ways. But when you take that perspective, and this is why I teach a lot through food as well, and highly curate those experiences, we're starting to understand how and why a wine is the way that it is based on the other agricultural and cultural influences that co-developed with the identity of that wine as well. And so traveling through food and wine is, in our imagination, whether it's in a restaurant or at home, really can bring us such an intimate experience, as you described, that you could think someone had been there a bunch of times.
So what happened?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's an interesting thought. It just hit me. When I started studying French, my wife was 15 years now. She's been doing this charity for an Armenian group, and she raised a lot of money for doing this big event. My house gets consumed by women for like 3 weeks. And so I thought, this is like the 15th year. I said, I can't deal with this anymore. So I'm just going to go in the room and I'm going to study French. My dad spoke French. So I wanted to learn French.
Yeah.
And I started with the applications, like Rosetta Stone, and there's a couple other fluens. And I realized it's impossible. I don't care how smart you are. You cannot learn a language through one of those applications because it has nothing to do with the culture. It has nothing to do with understanding Napoleon and Josephine. It has nothing to do with understanding Josephine Baker. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It's just this rote system that they think attacks your brain cells in a better way than the other guys. And until you decide that you're going to go to France or read about French or read about the revolution or read about whatever you want to read about, but understand the culture through the cultural heritage, is when you start to grasp the concept of the language and the food and the wine. And I tell the story many times, but my mom was an incredible cook, and she traveled the world as part of, the wine business as well. And it had been probably 50 years since I had smelled this quiche that she used to make, and it was in Paris. And my wife looked at me when the food was delivered, and she goes, "What's wrong with you?" Because my face had just changed. And I said, "I haven't smelled this for 50 years, and my mom used to make this exact quiche." And that's how memorable wine can be for an experience. Food, obviously, and then cultural understanding is so critical to that. And I think that's a really great approach that you're taking to.
When you open yourself up, I'm always the one crying over my food or laughing uncontrollably, or, I think food is very emotional, and I'm not afraid to open myself to it because that's the joy. I do love to help encourage people to enjoy their food more. But on another subject of language, I'm always trying to come up with different learning modalities that can help people approach this level of intimacy, because that's where real joy lies, right? Is knowing something closely. So I've come up with a new kind of workshop that I'm going to be developing this year and offering, which is a integrative language, food, and wine immersive day. So, for example, it's a way of learning French and Italian and Spanish. So that we'll have like classroom time in the morning to learn actual vocabulary and grammar around wine and food. Then a long lunch that's curated where people are allowed to speak English, but that will be, kind of integrating more vocabulary and language around the ingredients and service and all these things, but not in a oppressive kind of way. With little games like, having little cards that you can, identify which one is the mushroom, or which herb it is.
That's great.
And then in the afternoon, kind of return to the classroom, but to flow through tastings, through eating, and in partnership with, I speak these languages, but in partnership with people who are actually language teachers, so that we can come together. And then at the end of the day, it can either just inspire people to enrich their language studies that they're engaged in so that they can travel, for example, or so that they can read better about wine and understand the terms that are always in French, for example, or always in Italian.
I think that's a great approach. Alliance Française does that. Basically, the events you go, but you're going to curate them yourself and produce it. I think that's just the way to do it. And I'm making that analogy because a person's understanding of wine would benefit greatly also from understanding the culture. Like, for instance, and we're almost out of time here, but I'm a little jealous of the French protection of their regions for not only wine, but cheese and butter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to me because when I bring that up with the French, I was talking to Florence Catillard the other day, they also look at the New World, the Napa side of things, like, hey, we can go to Napa and do whatever we want, which is what they did.
Mm-hmm.
We plant whatever we want. We can decide what we want to grow. We can make whatever we want to. We don't have to, play by any rules. And I go, wow, the grass is always greener, I guess, when it comes to these kinds of things. But I think as Americans, and as culturally, or I'm not going to say restricted the American culture is because it's founded on freedom, but we don't seek those things. And here you are providing an opportunity for somebody that wants to learn those here, not having to travel. I think it's a great idea.
Well, I do like to point out, historically speaking, that, for example, about the New World, we as Americans often have this rigid idea that the Old World is, this historically rich, fixed place with, culture that never changes, and that the New World is all open. And actually, these things are not exactly true. And I have a lot to say about that. But one good example in Napa is that Cabernet Sauvignon was only first mentioned in the early mid 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an ancient grape variety, right? And so it's less than 100 years later, it appears in Napa. That's a profoundly historic
it was a mission, I think,
partnership that we have with Cabernet Sauvignon. So, for example, when I take people to Napa and Sonoma and we visit the axis of Cab and, these areas in Napa and Sonoma and potentially Lake County, this is also a deeply rich history that can be explored. And I think it's interesting to look at ourselves and look at the Old World differently, to look at the Old World and recognize the innovation, tradition. Emile Peynaud, the kind of probably the very first wine consultant, said, tradition is experimentation that worked. Right. And so there is no preserving tradition without being experimental and open. Right. And so traditions will die if you do not innovate them. And so I really like to open my mind to what that means as a American, or, for American wines and our traditions, which are real, and for the Old World too. So
I think, is that on your website?
Tradition is experimentation at work. Maybe. Yeah. I love to quote that.
I feel like I've heard it and I thought, well, I wouldn't have heard it otherwise. It's interesting because when I was talking to Florence, I looked up Smith Lafitte, and it had been founded like in 1379 or something like that. And here they bought the Louis Martini property, which was founded in, 1885 or something. I thought, wow, there's a 500-year difference between the founding of their two wineries, but just as important culturally for them to create this tradition. So I guess it can start any time. We are out of time.
Okay.
And we have plenty more to talk about.
Yeah, we do.
It's a fascinating conversation, and it's so inspiring to hear the things you're attacking to move the needle for the industry, for the consumer. It must light you up when you have somebody that you watch the light go on and go, wait a minute.
It's the best. That's why that's what it's all about, actually, especially. And the reason, I'll just finish, but when I first led one of these wine tours, I kind of fell into it. And at the end of the week, more than one person in the group said it was the best week of their life. Well, and this was the first time I'd ever done anything like this. And I thought, well, that's a vocation then. That's excellent. If I can give somebody that kind of joy and pleasure, then I must move towards that, because what's better in life than to
that's excellent.
Inspire others to live more richly.
Thanks for the time today, and we will definitely reconvene.
Okay, will do.